Welcome to the Fitrus Friday Conversation. Ama, thank you very much for joining us. So just for context, you're of course the head of culture and, the head of diversity and wellbeing at MHFA England, is that right?
No, it's actually head of culture and wellbeing.
Head of culture and wellbeing, I thought I got it the first time, never mind. So
right.
Just tell me a little bit more about how you sort of ended up with the role, how long you've been sort of in the role for, what it entails, and sort of how does that influence policy?
Okay, so my role is basically mainly internal, actually. So I've been in role since December, and I was hired into the role. The role is very much look at our internal culture and well-being to ensure that we, as an organisation, we're leading by example. So obviously, we, as don't know if for your listeners, Mental Health First Aid England is a social enterprise. Our mission is to change the mental health of the nation by training 1 in 10 people on mental health awareness skills. Our skill set, our training basically provides skill sets for people to be able to understand what mental health is and be able to signpost the people that they're supporting to the relevant support or resources around mental health and well-being. Sorry, excuse me, I'm not sure what's going on with my voice today. But so around mental health and well-being, we've trained over 500,000 people. We have a community of mental health first aiders, over 500,000, and we have consulted and also trained workplaces, over 20,000 workplaces. So most workplaces that we've trained will have mental health first aiders, but also as a mental health first aider, you can also support family and friends. So a lot of our information is on our website, mental health, MHFA-England.org. Basically our history, our resources, the training, if any of your colleagues are interested in becoming a mental health first aider or want to raise that awareness. We also have line manager training, so also for those that look after people to understand that. So my role is very much around, but actually it's changed since I've come into the business, but yes, so my role is very much around focusing on culture, which also is inclusion and diversity, but also thinking about our what culture we want to build in our workplace, the behaviors that we want to see, and also, but looking at specifically from mental health and wellbeing perspective. Recently with Black Lives Matter, I'm also taking on a huge responsibility around race, equity, and equality. But that's my background anyway. So my background is very much around diversity, inclusion, well-being, and culture. And I've worked for a variety of organizations in a variety of industries. So I've worked for big corporates, and I've also worked in startups too.
That's fantastic. So to start off with, in terms of sort of the link to the website, I'll certainly put that in the video description for MHFA England's website. The other thing which I particularly love about MHFA England, and is one of the reasons why sort of I became a youth mental health first aid instructor, is the vision that MHFA England have in terms of wanting to train up 1 in 10 individuals in the UK with sort of or in England in fact with sort of MHFA skills, which I thought is a fabulous vision, and it's something which really sort of attracted me to becoming a youth MHFA instructor anyway. But I thought I'd ask specifically around sort of the topic of racism, given sort of the current cultural context that we're in at the moment, sort of the headlines in recent months around Black Lives Matter, around the idea of discrimination and what that looks like, both overt and subvert, sort of below the water as well. But I just wanted to sort of explore this idea of the impact of racism on mental health specifically, and what that entails. I think what's always helpful to viewers, to anyone who's watching, is I suppose when we share personal stories, personal examples, personal experiences of stuff that happens, that I think really helps us to sort of resonate and really drive the point home. I just wanted to ask if you have had any sort of personal experience of racism before, how that's impacted you, or even if that has had an impact on your mental health or not. I'd be grateful if you could share that.
Yeah, sure. I do think it's a very interesting question. So I was not born in London. I was born in Ghana. I'm from West Africa. My family moved here when I was probably about 9 or 10, and I guess my first ever experience of racism was in the school playground. But interestingly enough, even though it was racism, I guess fought back in a way. I was called a name, and I called the name back to the individual. But actually, let me give you context. So I was in the playground, and I don't know, just out of nowhere, this girl decided to call me a pig. Oh no, I think she called me another name before that, and then she called me a pig, and then I responded, "But you look more of the color of a pig than I do." And that was like, but because I didn't think any of it. I mean, to me, I guess it was racism in a way because of the name calling that was being called. But in my mind, it was just logic in the sense of the fact that there was a white person calling me a pig, when in fact, after she called me, a monkey or whatever, when in fact she was more of a color than a pig, and I was just making that statement. I wasn't, I think it's really interesting being that I wasn't, obviously, yes, I was 9 and 10, a child, but I guess for me, looking back on it, I could see that that was definitely a racial encounter as opposed to just a kid calling me names, just because of the malice she had in her view and her intent to really make me want to be upset. Obviously when she called me a monkey, I said I'm not a monkey because I know I'm not a monkey. But I think it was, and I think I give kudos to my parents for that, because whilst they have told us, and talked to us about racism and just obviously having to work 10 times as hard, etc., they've never made us feel that we were inferior to anybody else. So, for me, having that first experience and obviously coming to a country that was very different, it was quite, for me, it was an interesting experience, but I don't think it was like, oh my God, a shocking one, because my mindset wasn't put in that way. And also because I was very young. I think I've had a few, obviously, experiences since then. I've had experiences when I've walked into a corporate room and because of my role or the fact that I've been, predominantly the only Black person and only Black women in most of the roles that I come into, because when I talk to and who I have to work with usually is majorly sometimes senior people, and obviously we know the setup of that is very predominantly white, and it's very rare that you work with senior people and it's actually mixed or it's diverse. So I remember coming into the rooms to join meetings, and people would like look at me as if to say I'm in the wrong place, or when I ever used to speak up, they'd be like, "Oh, you're very articulate." And then when I used to say to them, or they'd ask me where I'm from, and obviously the question is, where are you really from? And I would say I was born in Ghana. They'd be like, "Oh, well, you speak really, where did you learn English?" Like people in Ghana don't speak English. It was little things like that I pretty much get on a daily basis.
Sure.
Quite a lot. So it was those things. And actually very recently, with Brexit, my husband and I have encountered some very racial slurs on the bus going home. And actually I was also in the corporate world being told that I can't sit with my fellow Black colleagues either because it doesn't look inclusive. So, and those two are quite recent, I would say, in the last sort of 2 years. So it's still very prevalent in the UK. And I think that's one thing I really want to hone in for, because with the Black Lives Matter movement and George Floyd, what a lot of people are still wanting to separate that with the US as opposed to the UK. And yes, whilst police brutality is on a different level, because obviously, it is different to an extent, doesn't mean it's not there isn't still police brutality happening in the UK, or there isn't racism happening in the UK. I think people need to really understand and acknowledge that fact, that there is a huge divide systemically in terms of racial institutions, in terms of society, in every corner that we look at, whether it's politics, medicine, health, education, corporate, UK. you know, it does exist, and the acknowledgement has to come from that. And yes, it might be different from the US, but it's not, the experiences aren't necessarily hugely dissimilar. So I think what I really think was interesting with Black Lives Matter is that it, for the first time, has had such a global movement, and I think we need to be very cautious not to let that go. And I think the reason why a lot of people caught on to that is because it's from a humanity context. We saw someone die at the hands of someone else. And whilst we've seen it happen before, for some reason, this was very different. And I think that if people are supporting from that humanity context, and they need to still remember that the humanity context still exists in racism, it is exactly that. You are denying someone the human rights to be equal, but also to have equity and, you know, have a level playing field in the world. And I mean, that's a very kind of surface description of what I'm talking about. It goes a lot deeper. So I think it's really important that it's acknowledged and things start to change for the better, if not for our generation, but definitely for the next generation, the generation after them. So in terms of whether I have it, if it's had an impact on my mental health, you know, that's a really interesting thing, because I haven't really thought of it that way up until recently, and especially up until working with Mental Health First Aid England. I have had other incidences that have impacted my mental health, but I've never really thought about racism being one of them, just because, like I said to you, you know, my parents, and also not just my parents, but my aunties, my uncles, you know, my mentors have always said, you've got to work 10 times harder, you've got to keep pressing on and keep pushing on. And I think that's actually the key thing here, is that I probably have experienced it, but because I've suppressed it and just kept going, because it's, for me, it's like, I can't stop. I just have to keep going. I can't allow this to impact me. Otherwise they'll win, all this other stuff. You just keep pressing on. And I'm sure I'm not the only person that has experiences or feels that way. It's only until when you realize that you're having to relive the trauma by retelling your stories, when you're having to relive the trauma by watching those videos that are circulating on the internet, the videos that are circulating on the internet, it's very traumatic. When you are having to go through your career and wonder why you don't have a promotion or not given a promotion, or wonder why, you know, certain things are happening that don't make sense because you're working equally as hard, if not twice as hard. You know, you're very good at your job. You know, you are really good at your job, and you're still not getting the recognition or reward for it. Those things impact you and are very traumatic. So I would say probably in an indirect way, yes, it has affected my well-being. I've just not been, I guess, tuned into it, or I've not allowed it to get the best of me. I think that's the best way to describe it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, there's a lot to unpack there. But you know, what you mentioned about your upbringing and how, you know, there's this sort of an expectation where, you know, you've got to work 10 times harder because of sort of the way in which we are, because of how we've been born, the way we've been raised, you know, purely because based on gender or sexuality or race, that, you know, we have a certain sort of starting position in life, and so we've got to work 10 times harder. I think that's very relatable, actually. I just wanted to sort of touch on this point around, so there was a sort of something that you mentioned around this idea of these little judgments that people make, whether that is a comment on how well, you know, how well you spoke English, or how eloquent you are, or whatever, you know. And I think it's not just, in my experience, it's not just what they say, but how it's said as well. It's that tone that's around, that sort of tone of surprise, saying, "Oh, I didn't know," you know. And I think it's these little sort of microaggressions, I think, is what it's known as, if I'm not mistaken, that sort of really play a role. And I don't know if that's something you want to expand on in any way, shape, or form.
Yes, you're right. It is microaggressions. I think with microaggressions, it's very much the tone behind it and the connotation around what they're saying. There's ways of actually asking something because you are quite naive and you want to understand a bit more about it. And there's ways of asking that question by starting by saying, I don't know much about that, can you tell me? But a lot of people have quite a lot of ego and pride, that they don't want to come off as not being educated or articulate, especially if you're in the workplace, because there's this whole standard of, well, if you got the job here, you must be smart. So if you're portraying that you're not smart, then it becomes a different conversation, right? But also I think those microaggressions are very much linked to sometimes bias, and conscious bias as well as unconscious bias, in terms of the stereotypes people will have of certain people because of their background, because of, you know, their sexuality, because of their their upbringing, or whatever it might be. And people always jump to assumptions and perceptions more so first, because they want to fill in the gaps rather than actually really ask the right questions to fill in those gaps. But also sometimes it's very much used as a weaponized tool to make someone feel very inferior, or to make someone feel less of the person that they are. And it's you know, if you know, the fact that someone asking me if I'm articulate or not, that did really annoy me a lot of the time, but I also knew what they were getting at, so I would never give them the satisfaction to make them think that why wouldn't I be? And that was it got to a point where I remember somebody did try to say, or try to intimate that I can't say the word, but tried to basically make the point that because I was Black, I shouldn't be speaking the way I'm speaking, to which I responded to how Black people supposed to speak, and that person was not expecting that response back. And I think I'm very well known for that. When if I feel the need to question, I will question or respond back in a way to make you think about what you've just said, without me having to do much around you actually making sure you understood that what you said was not right. I'm not what's the word? I also don't have any issues pointing out to people if they have, or should I say pointing out to people that they have said something wrong, but I wouldn't do it in a really bad way or derogatory way. I think it's around making that person understand. And some people already do understand, but it's around that person, making that person understand that I know what they're trying to do, and it's not right. They might have tried it with other people and got away with it, but not necessarily with me. And I know that it's easier said than done, because I know that there are some people that would rather just keep quiet because they have so much more to risk. And that should not be a world that we should be living in right now. I think microaggressions is a very interesting thing, because like I said, I do think that there are some people that are genuinely saying it but have no clue what they're saying is actually not right, or not a nice thing to say, and actually has its impacts. And I think when you do correct those individuals, they do make a point of not saying those things again. You know, whether it's to do with your hair, can I touch your hair, which I've had loads of times, whether it's to do with where are you from, no, where are you from actually, those type of questions, it's like they're intrusive, and sometimes they're not necessary. And actually, I think there is something healthy about being curious. I can't speak to that, I don't know, curious, but there's also something very much about being respectful and actually understanding those boundaries. So the questions that you're asking, there's nothing necessarily wrong if you're asking the right questions in the right way. But if you're not, then don't expect a response. You know, I often really think that people need to think about, if those questions were asked to them, how would they feel? But I don't think that necessarily is the right question to actually throw back, because some people won't even think about it, even if those questions were asked to them, because of their privilege, because of the lifestyle that they've led, or the life that they've led has never given them has never exposed them to those different cultures or those different adversities that others might go to. So sometimes just saying, well, if the role was reversed, how would you feel, is actually not the right question, because if the roles were reversed, they'd probably still feel exactly the same way and not feel much about it. There's a very big education piece around language and how it's used. and in the context it's used and the relationships that you have with individuals in order for you to think it's okay to use it or not. But I don't think microaggressions is a good thing in any shape or form. Yes, I hope I've answered your question. I know I've been kind of...
No, you certainly have. I just wanted to sort of touch on this idea of momentum, and also this idea of similarities in terms of hurdles that are faced by ethnic minority communities, whether that is the Black community or communities of color in general. You touched upon, the Black Lives Matter movement and how it's got a lot more momentum now than it has before. It feels different, as you mentioned, now than it has been before, and it's blown up to this sort of an international movement. And you sort of also mentioned that there is this perception that Black Lives Matter is more American-centric or is more relevant to African Americans than it is to the Black community in the UK, or the Black community in France, or the Black community anywhere else, frankly speaking. But of course, that's not the case. You've sort of mentioned around sort of the hurdles and the various sort of issues which Black communities and of course certain communities of color will also face as well. I just wanted to ask whether you could touch upon some of those hurdles which they're faced, and there is obviously a ton out there. So just if you could touch on a few that communities of color or the Black community face in particular, and perhaps shed a little bit of light on how that might impact their mental health in some way, shape, or form.
So I can't speak for the whole entire community, but I think I have an idea. And I think what's great about this is that this whole movement is the stories that are coming out, because I think for a very long time, people of color, Black people, anyone from an ethnic background has all been clumped together, which is also why I have an issue sometimes with labels and the word BME, because that is exactly what it does. It clusters everybody together without actually understanding the diversity and the identities within that are different according to each group, but also within that, there's different subsets within that too. And I think by clustering and putting everybody together, that's where you lose the authenticity around inclusion and diversity in its realist form. So to answer your question, yes, when we think about racism or slavery or whatever you want to, those two contexts, we always think about America first, because a lot of it publicized there. But if we think about the roots of slavery and where, how it derived from, the UK was also very much involved in it. Last weekend, there was a huge march around repatriations, 1st of August, Emancipation Day, in that context of slavery and the history around it. And I think because people are, and again, I think media has a huge responsibility to play in this, because when you shine a particular light on a particular country or continent, and you don't share its diversity in terms of the stories and what's happening, people just paint a picture and say, oh, that's happening over there. The reason why I think Black Lives Matter is really, the movement hasn't gathered momentum, is because for the first time globally, people have participated in protests. People have participated and are still participating in how to make things different and right. Because they are starting to share, Black people and people of color are starting to share the atrocities that are happening to them in their own countries and in their own continents. Well, majority in their own countries. And actually, when you look at it, like I said, police brutality in the US is very different from the UK, but it doesn't mean that it's still not happening in the UK. And that's the connections. You can see the connectivities depending, it doesn't matter how huge the scale is or how small the impact is. It's still the connectivity resonating because of the experience they've had with those individuals. So I would say there's a lot of things that have impacted people of color and Black people in the UK. I've mentioned them before in the beginning of when I was, when we're talking about it. First of all, there are things like social injustice. And when you think about social injustice, it's when we look at society, what are the things that we have access to that we should have access to? So education, health, jobs, corporate UK, if we look at the criminal justice system, all of those different in society, and I'm sure there's more, but I'm just using those because they're pretty much the predominant ones, but those as an example. If you look at the experiences that Black people and people of color, people from ethnic background have gone through, have been exposed to in those I guess areas, it's not a nice story. It's not a great story, because the narrative has predominantly come from people, not people of color or Black people. The narrative, the people that are in power, the people that influence those infrastructures, those systems and processes, they're not diverse. So it's really frustrating because you're trying to make your way in the world and you're being told you can't do that because the color of your skin. And it's not, you're being told indirectly, unless of course you have those people that are really brave enough to tell you it's that reason. You can't access healthcare. Healthcare is something that should be, we have the NHS, but we all access it very differently, So I think that in itself, every day you're trying to just make it through the day. And that has its challenges within itself, whether, you're working, not working, whatever it is, you have a family or a carer. Every day you have your, as I call it, life hacks. You're just trying to make it through the day. And that has its challenges on your mental health and well-being, especially around from a stress perspective. You're stressed. Some people might have depression. Some people might have anxiety on top of that, amongst other things. And they're just trying to get through the day. Now, if you keep adding all these different layers of disadvantage, of lack of accessibility, of fearing for your life, because you are a person of color, a Black person, what do you think that will do with someone's mental health? It's not going to make them feel positive about life or very positive about anything. Do you know what I mean? So I hope I'm articulating this right, but my point is when there are such high levels of inequality, and the statistics out there and research that proves it, whether you're looking at it from corporate America, where there isn't enough senior people in high senior positions or C-suite, when you're looking at it from, just even COVID-19 and the impact it's had on Black people and people of color and people from ethnic backgrounds, actually, and the treatment that they've received. When you are a frontline worker, a nurse or doctor or whatever, and you don't want your patient who is not a person of color doesn't want to be treated by you because you're a person of color. I don't even have to talk about our criminal justice system. There's lots more research out there that talks about the unfair justice, injustice of criminal, in the criminal justice system that is very unfair towards Black people and predominantly people of color compared to the white counterparts. Let's talk about media. When the media wants to talk about people of color or Black people, if you look at look at the headlines. There've been a couple of headlines in the media where if it's not a person of color, they don't describe that person as the person of color. But when it's actually involved with someone of color, suddenly that's the headline. Their color or their ethnicity is involved in that. And that headline is a very negative headline. So, when you are portrayed negatively, when you are never given a fair level playing field to excel, all of these things all play a part to your mental health and well-being, because every day you are having to deal with the trauma of reliving some kind of experience because you're a Black, a person of color, or someone from an ethnic background. Because every day there's a hurdle that someone tells you, and that someone is usually someone who is privileged or has white privilege, that tells you you don't belong here and you shouldn't be here, or what are you doing here? Like, if you have to justify yourself every time with those 3 questions alone, like, I do belong here, why shouldn't I be here? And I do deserve to be here. Again, sorry, I'm quite passionate and quite emotional about this,
so
because
you should be. Yeah, absolutely.
It's not right. It is in 2020, and it was interesting because we were having a conversation around people saying, I can't believe it's happening in 2020. And I think that holds depending on, again, who says it, it's true, it shouldn't be happening in 2020, but usually we talk about microaggressions. And I've heard people say it in that context, but it's more like are you sure? As opposed to why is this still happening?
Exactly.
And that's another classic case of, microaggressions, or I don't see color. Hello, well, I'm sorry, I don't play to that card. I generally don't agree with that statement.
Yeah.
Because saying you don't see color means you don't see me. It means you don't acknowledge my experience, my journey, and who I am.
Absolutely.
And again, there's other ways of rephrasing that. If you mean to say, I see your color, but it doesn't make a difference to me because I think that, you do deserve to be here and you should be here. And for me, that is more important than it. That's a different conversation. So I hope I've answered your question, and I know I keep going in and out of different things, but I think for me, it's huge. It makes a huge difference, and actually it makes a huge impact to people of color and Black people. And also I think just even the diagnosis and prognosis, and I'm not an expert in that field, so again, I just want to have that disclaimer, but I'm pretty sure if you were to do a bit more deeper research and look at the research that's been provided, again, I always make the statement of this, that you should not make decisions for people who don't input in those decisions. So my point, and that's more around corporate more than anything else, but I think it applies to everything else, is if you are creating or doing or building something and you're not involving the people that you're creating and building it for, who are you creating and building it for? Yourself. So there's the same context of if you are trying to build a culture of inclusion, again, if you're not involving those individuals, especially those individuals that have been marginalized in that process, and I mean by involving, I mean them having a seat at the table, but also talking about it and making an impact at that table, not just being there for just table dressing, as I like to call it. Then then you are being a bit more inclusive than just saying you've got to sit at the table and that's it. So for me, it's the same thing when it comes to health and well-being. If you don't have doctors and nurses, whoever is doing the prognosis or whoever is actually doing the treatment, if they don't come from a background that resonates with those people who are being treated, of course you're going to mistreat them and misdiagnose them because you have no idea, no clue about their background, their origin. So I think there's something definitely in that piece around researching better, but also if you're looking at every cornerstone of society, if there are less people of color, less Black people, less people of ethnicity in senior roles, or again, roles that have influence and power to make change and see things from a different perspective and truly bring in those stories and those experiences into the processes, the systems, the policies we write. If it's not truly representative of a diverse community, then there is something, then someone loses out. And unfortunately, it's predominantly people of color, Black people, and people from ethnic backgrounds that are always impacted by this.
Exactly. I mean, your passion is very clear on this, and I do appreciate it because but at the end of the day, if we're not going to have a frank and an honest conversation around this, then we're not going to get anywhere. I just wanted to sort of highlight a few examples that actually I came across, which I just sort of wanted to build on what you've just said and just ask a couple of more questions, if you don't mind, before we round things up for today. So, I mean, you mentioned around this just near the end there, around healthcare access. It's really interesting because I was having a look at the Mental Health Foundation website this morning and statistics around sort of the experiences of the Black community and people of color when it comes to seeking treatment for mental health conditions. And what's been found is that the rates of diagnosis amongst the Black community and communities of color are lower than their white counterparts. And primarily the reason behind that is because they're not believed when they come across to say that, look, I've got these symptoms, or I've been experiencing this level of anxiety for a number of days, weeks, months, whatever the case may be. And, they're simply not believed as much. And like you mentioned, one of the factors most likely is the fact that people of color and those from the Black community are not fairly represented in healthcare, right? They're not being treated by doctors or nurses or pharmacists of similar backgrounds. it's also interesting that you talked about this, and I'm just trying to remember the exact one. You mentioned somewhere in the middle around sort of inclusion in the corporate sector, for example. I remember I read an article very recently on the BBC a few days ago from a Hollywood actor, Anthony Mackie. So he played a character in one of the Marvel movies, and he's going to be the new Captain America. And he mentioned that as a Black person, that how he's frustrated by the fact that there is not enough representation in Hollywood, and that specifically his employers, Marvel, are not doing enough. He mentioned how, for example, you look at just the one movie that they produced, Black Panther, which had script writers and directors and producers and costume designers and actors who are all Black. But you look at every other movie that Marvel have created, again, the screenwriters and the producers and directors and everyone who is behind the scenes are primarily white. And that's extremely frustrating, because then people's stories are not being told authentically in that regard, which I thought was a really interesting perspective, which I thought I'd share. Just one last example, actually, which I thought I'd add, if you don't mind me saying, which is this idea of media. And I thought that was extremely powerful what you said, because it feels so relatable. As a Muslim born and bred in this country, I can relate to the idea of, when there's something good happening, and if it is a brown Muslim or a Black Muslim, or even a Black person who is not Muslim, doesn't really matter. Their ethnicity, their cultural background, their religious background is not touched upon. But the moment something bad happens, their culture is put on the front page. Their ethnic origin comes on the front page. Their religious background comes on the front page, and that's extremely frustrating. I mean, you see, a really good example I saw in a Netflix documentary around the US presidential elections, right? You had, in 1988, I believe it was, you had George Bush Sr. coming up against the Democratic nominee, whose name was Dukakis. And he had a significant lead over George Bush Sr. And what really turned it around for George Bush Sr., and he won it in the end, was his sort of being tough on crime, sort of status. And they used the example of Willie Horton, and they plastered his face all over the media, a Black person treated as a criminal, and saying that Dukakis is soft on crime, Bush will be tough on crime. And the moment you put that out, and the moment you sort of race bait, voters will vote with fear. And Bush won on a campaign of fear and racism, frankly speaking. So yeah, it's troubling to say the least. And I think, I find that it can be very despondent to think about how much trouble there is, how much suffering there is, how many hurdles there are that people like you and me have to overcome. But I suppose one sort of, and I just want to ask these last couple of questions before we round up today. I try to end things on a positive note. Where do you think we're going in terms of, or in fact, let me ask this a different way. How do you think we can do things better? How do you think people who have got privilege, who are born in positions of privilege, or who are in powerful positions, what can they do better to try and address the issue of racism today, and thereby alleviating mental health issues that may be occurring in the Black community or communities of color?
That's a very good question. I think for me, what I would say for that is that people need to check their privilege. But I think the first thing about doing it is acknowledging. So acknowledging that this is generally happening to people of color and Black people. That it's not something that just happened yesterday and suddenly woke up and realized that. This is something that has been generally been going on for centuries, and we've been experiencing it for a very long time. Now, I'm always a firm believer of, until you know, you don't know, but now you know. So now everybody in this world cannot say, oh, they didn't know, because, I mean, there's been plenty of opportunity prior to this Black Lives Movement and George Floyd for people to know. And for some reason, I don't know why, it hasn't got any traction or carried on. I think what people can do better is very much around acknowledging and seeing how they can, acknowledging self-education, so educating themselves around the history of white fragility, the history of Black people and people of color, about racism specifically, and then checking their own bias, checking their own selves, and seeing where they could have made a difference that they didn't, and now the opportunity is here for them to do so. I do believe that, you know, people need to, white people, non-people, people of white people who aren't of the ethnic background, or people of color, Black people, will need to be uncomfortable before they get comfortable. And that's something that they're just going to have to do. And they need to also get over themselves. And I don't mean that in a, like, get over yourself, but I generally feel like, yeah, it's not about how you are feeling in this process. It's around how you, to the extent of, in a way, is about how you are feeling. Because I think you need to acknowledge, or they need to acknowledge, that this is how they feel, but there's actually something bigger that they need to be addressing, and then have that. I also think, so yeah, so there's acknowledgement, and then there is education. And there's lots and lots of resources out there through the Black Lives Movement. I mean, you just need to, there's lots of books, videos, movies, everything. There's a semantical resource out there that you can literally read to find out a bit more about a historical context till present day. So there's not an excuse. And then I think, again, is so looking at your, when I say their power of influence, or their circle of influence, how they can influence better. So if they are making, like I said, if you're a decision maker and you are making decisions around the room, and you notice that you're making decisions that impact communities, people of color, Black people, ethnic communities, and there's no one around that table influencing that impact, then maybe you need to stop and think about why that is, and how you get those voices in the room to influence and change those decisions that you're making before you decide on them. I also think there's a lot around behavior. So again, what role modeling behavior are you modeling? Are you sitting in silence while you do see behaviors in the workplace that should not be in the workplace, whether it's directly or indirect? Are you leading by example, by how you diversify who you talk to, and also your way of thinking, your perspectives? Or do you always go to the same people again and again, and those people look exactly like you? Because if they do, I think you need to challenge yourself to, again, get a diverse group of people where they challenge your perception, and they also challenge the way you're thinking and make you think a bit differently, or at least sow those seeds in, so you can start thinking about asking the right questions to make the right decisions. Now, don't do it for a tokenistic ways, because when you do it as a tokenistic thing, it's very, very obvious, and it comes back to bite you anyway. So there's a very much thing around being authentic in that. I think also, so I mentioned, calling out behavior, but also with your family and friends. So it doesn't just stop in the workplace, right? It stops within it's both personal and professional. You can't be one way well, you can, but again, that's not authentic. But you should have the same influence and actually question the same things, both in your personal and your professional life. More so, I think, because you can't say one thing and then go behind closed doors and do another thing, because again, it all unravels and doesn't show that you're being authentic. So I think for me, in that waffling that I've just waffled, I think those are the key things. I definitely think acknowledgement first, educating yourselves and checking your bias and your privilege, your white privilege specifically, understanding the voices, listening to the voices, understanding and hearing the voices of people of color, Black people, from ethnic backgrounds. And then I think there's around what you can do to change. Now, a lot of people think I need to do something big. If you've got the not capacity, but if you're in that position of power that you can do something big, then yes, do that. But you could also start with small things, and that will cause a rippling effect to make things bigger. So, I think it's within your world and within your sphere. What can you do in the position of power that you have and influence to change whatever industry or sector you're working in, to change that and to make a difference? So whether it's through policy making, whether it's through changing how you hire people, where you look at your employee life cycle and make sure at each step there is an intervention from an inclusive perspective, whether it's not just about equality, but also equity. So those individuals not just have a fair playing ground, but they also are part of the groups that are making those decisions, etc. are there. And then also in your private life and your friends, your family, calling out bad behavior, educating your children around just how to be a more anti-racist ally are starting points that lead to bigger points.
Sure. So you sort of mentioned, so just to summarize, if I was to put it into 3 steps, it would be raising my awareness, sort of reading up on the history of it, increasing my knowledge, and then wielding my power of influence in order to exhibit change in society. I think that perhaps sums it up in one way.
Yeah. And raising my awareness, as I said, is acknowledging this is happening.
Yeah. Acknowledging.
In those communities, and listening. So and I think the listening part is really big. It's, you listen without interference, you listen without being judgmental, you listen to the experiences, the lived experiences of those individuals, because that will enable you to know what to change and how to change it. But it also enables you to include them in the narrative, the new narrative, which should be multiple voices, not just one.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. Ama, before we head off today, just one last thing, and I like to sort of end things on a personal positive touch, you could say. With all that's going on, whether that is on a macro level, on a micro level, what do you do for self-care, out of interest? What do you do to take care of yourself emotionally and mentally?
Oh, what do I do? Good question. I do. So I had a day off yesterday and I did absolutely nothing. And then I went to the gym. Oh yes, I'm one of those brave people that are going back to the gym. And that was really good. Just because I'm actually, whilst I'm going to the gym, I'm very cautious, but I'm actually really excited to go back because fitness is one of my outlets. And when we were obviously on lockdown, I couldn't do that. And my home is my sanctuary, so I don't tend to use it as my gym. So I'm glad that my gym has opened and they are definitely adhering to social distancing and health and safety standards. So that's fine. But other than that, I do lots of different things, whether it's just sort of catching up on my latest Netflix binge. I do that. I go for walks. I try and go for a walk, or what I'm trying to get now to do is to go do some hiking every weekend. My husband loves to walk and hike, so I'm trying to get into that. Hopefully, as a new starter, to do once a week, once every weekend, or as much, or twice a month. We'll see how it goes. But that's my whole kind of new setting trend that I'm trying to do. Anything like self-care. So I do love either listening to music. I love listening to music. I love reading. I haven't done enough reading though, but I need to do more of that. But that's one of the things I do. I love interior design, decor. So sometimes I will do something around the house to do that. I reupholster lampshades as a hobby. So I might, from time to time do that. Just stuff like pampering, doing your nails. When things go back to having a massage would be definitely on my list again. Spending time with family and friends, close friends, love that. I love that fact of just sharing and laughing and eating good food. I'm a huge foodie, so for me, coming together with friends to eat as opposed to just eating on your own is something I love to do. So I think mine is just generally, I guess pre-COVID, go to the cinema, go to the theatre. So I love arts, that kind of stuff. I love sports. in the sense of just getting active. As I mentioned, interior design, but I also like massages, all the nice kind of good body feel stuff. So, you know, people meditate. I actually pray. I'm Christian, and that's a form of meditation, which people actually don't think it actually is. So, yeah, all those things really. Most of all, it's just spending time with loved ones, because I think one thing that COVID has definitely put to light is that, and we all knew this anyway, but you never promise tomorrow today. So I think you only have one life to live, and filling that with the things that you love doing, but more so with the people you love, is really important. So for me, definitely spending as much time as possible with loved ones, but just doing fun stuff as well, and exploring new things. So some of the new things there are some things on my list that I'm going to try and explore to help with self-care, but it could be just anything, you know. And I love to sleep. I know I keep saying this and everyone keeps laughing at me, but I think rest is a great way.
It is. It's underrated, isn't it?
It is so underrated. And I think, you know, when people take their time off, they feel like they have to be doing stuff. Like I said, I had a long weekend just recently, and I did a couple of things at the beginning. So the Friday, Saturday, did some stuff, but yesterday I did absolutely nothing. I just was in bed just resting, and then later on in the evening I went to my spin class, and I came home, had dinner, and then went to bed. So, and I'm really grateful for that, because I just think just being still and resting is very underrated, but should definitely be explored and be done more often.
I agree. Let's end it off there. I really appreciate your time and your energy, your passion, and your commitment to this cause, honestly. And I think it's really opened my eyes. I hope it's opened the eyes of the viewers who check this out. And thank you just once again for coming on. Thank you so much, Ama.
No, thank you. I did forget to mention what we are doing for Mental Health First Aid England, but we have got our statement of intent on our website, which talks about, and as you know, because you were part of when we had our discussions with our external community, which I think is a great thing. Yeah. But we've now published our statement of intent and what we're planning to do and hoping to do. Not hoping, but what we will be doing, being more positive and affirmative in that action. And yes, so if anybody is interested, again, it's on our website, as I mentioned before. Brilliant. So do have a look.
I'll post a link to that in our video description. That's absolutely fine.
Wonderful. Thank you. And thanks for having me.
Thank you. No, I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
YouTube. No, it was my pleasure.